What chance did a woman have in a naval courtroom where even the law was written by men who believed piracy was unnatural in a woman? The answer, as history coldly reveals, was almost none. Captured female pirates were rarely offered mercy. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the so-called Golden Age of Piracy, British Admiralty courts showed little tolerance for piracy of any kind, but female defendants were seen as doubly transgressive. They had violated not only imperial law, but gender norms deeply embedded in the social order. Trials took place in makeshift naval tribunals, often held in colonies like Jamaica or New Providence. These courts operated without juries, and the outcomes were typically predetermined. The legal process was swift, but not without theatrics. Testimonies were gathered from ship captains, naval officers, and, at times, frightened sailors who feared their own association with piracy. The accused had few legal rights. Beyond the bare facts of procedure, there was theatre in every corner of those tribunals. Wooden benches scratched with years of damp and salt, candles guttering in the oppressive heat, a judge's robes smelling faintly of tar and tobacco. These were the small details that made the room itself an accomplice to conviction. A woman walked into those courts already measured and found wanting by men who would not only judge her actions, but her very existence. Her hair, her clothes, the cut of her speech, everything was sifted for proof of unnaturalness. The law that sat on tables in black-bound volumes had been forged in a world that equated propriety with submission. To be outside of that narrow script invited suspicion, and to be outside of it with a sword in hand invited a kind of fury that was almost religious. Bonny and Mary Read, two of the most notorious female pirates in history, stood trial in 1720 in Spanish Town, Jamaica. According to the official court transcript, when Bonny was condemned to death, she retorted bitterly to her lover, Calico Jack, "If you had fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog." Their defense? Pregnancy. Known as pleading the belly, it was one of the few legal protections afforded to women. In Bonny and Read's case, it worked, temporarily. But most female pirates did not share their luck. Many faced their verdicts in silence, knowing the court had already judged them guilty long before they ever spoke. Pleading the belly was a desperate human gambit. A woman's body, even when reviled by law, retained the capacity to evoke protection. It was an awkward inconsistency in a system built to erase inconvenient lives. Midwives were summoned, hands tested for the curve of an abdomen, and the slow ritual that followed could buy time. Time that might mean the difference between life and death. Yet even this small mercy revealed the brutal arithmetic of the era. A fetus might be spared the noose for reasons of future property and paternal honor, while the woman who carried it remained a transgressive object to be disciplined or hidden away until she no longer threatened the moral order. For most women accused of piracy, however, such procedural loopholes were either unavailable or insufficient. Their bodies were politicized in ways that stripped them of agency, even when that body itself might be used as a last defense. The river rolled silently past Wapping, but the cries of the crowd shattered the morning calm. Here, at London's infamous execution dock, countless pirates, men and women, met their end, dangling from the gallows just above the murky waters of the Thames. It was here that the British Empire made a gruesome example of piracy, and female pirates, though rare, were no exception. Execution Dock was not merely a place of death. It was a stage on which the empire performed its sovereignty. The tide marked time and destiny. The water that had once carried the pirate's vessel now bore witness to his or her final humiliation. The route from Newgate to Wapping became a procession of humiliation and pedagogy. Onlookers who lined narrow streets and quays were not mere spectators. They were participants in the ritual of public terror. Vendors sold cheap ale and crisp bread. Children craned their necks. Clergy muttered prayers. In that long procession, the condemned were reduced to signs that said in the loudest possible terms, "Defy the crown, and you will be erased in front of your community." Under British maritime law, piracy was a capital crime. The Piracy Act of 1698, passed under King William III, made clear that all and every person so offending shall suffer pains of death. Unlike land-based executions, these hangings were carried out by the Admiralty, and the chosen site, Execution Dock, served as a symbol. Pirates would die with the tide that had once given them freedom. The law itself was blunt and absolute, its language a kind of moral thermometer. But laws do not interpret themselves. Men interpret them, and those men were often anxious guardians of empire. When a woman stood accused, the language of the law was supplemented by a rhetoric of betrayal. She was painted as unnatural, as a figure who had not simply taken to the sea, but had attempted to invert the social hierarchy. The penalties were not just punitive, they were exemplary in the most literal sense. The spectacle of a pirate's body swinging over the Thames was intended to be a deterrent, to teach a brutal civic lesson. The sea might be wide, but the empire's arm was wider still. Women found guilty of piracy were sentenced with the same finality as men. The executions followed a cruel ritual. The condemned were led from Newgate Prison, paraded through London in a cart under armed guard, jeered at by crowds. Once at Wapping, they were made to stand under the gallows, sometimes with the noose already tightened around their necks. They were not dropped with a long fall to ensure quick death. Instead, the short drop caused prolonged strangulation, a method known as the Marshal's dance, as the body would convulse grotesquely before stilling. That violence was designed down to the smallest detail. Executioners were craftsmen of suffering, trained to maintain the ritual precisely so that spectacle and punishment fed one another. The Marshal's dance was not a failure of mercy, it was the point. The twitching body under the pale sky was intended to dissuade and to degrade, to make the public feel something close to power, an ugly satisfaction in the knowledge that a transgression had been utterly defeated. For women, the horror was doubled. Their public death was a repudiation, not just of their crimes, but of their very possibility of stepping beyond prescribed roles. The noose silenced questions and made the crowd complicit in a moral order that sanctioned public cruelty as civic education. Though female pirate executions were fewer in number, they were no less brutal. Mary Critchett, an American woman who joined a crew of escaped convicts turned pirates in 1729, was captured near Virginia and tried in Williamsburg. Found guilty of piracy, she was sentenced to death and hanged, without fanfare, without delay. No pleas of pregnancy saved her. Mary Critchett's swift execution speaks to another grim truth. Geographic and social distance often meant that the norms applied unevenly. In provincial courts far from the administrative centre, mercy could be rarer and punishment swifter. The spectacle in London was theatrical. The justice in outlying counties was merely efficient and forgetful. Critchett's story, like so many others, slips too readily into the margins of history because there was no interested elite to memorialize her. She became a footnote in a ledger that recorded policy rather than personhood. These public executions were meant not just to punish, but to terrify. The bodies of the worst offenders were left hanging until 3 tides had washed over them, a punishment called gibbeting. While this was more common for male pirates, the very threat was a message to all. Piracy would not be forgiven, regardless of gender. The image of a body left to rot above the tide is an image of empire's cruelty made permanent. Gibbeting turned the executed into a landscape marker, a grim signpost, warning of the consequences of rebellion. In some harbours, the skeletons of gibbeted men and women became part of the cartography of imperial control. Sailors learned routes by reference to such grim coordinates. Mothers pointed them out to children as a moral lesson. The human being dissolved into a totem of fear, and the sea that once offered freedom now became a countryside of admonition. In the shadow of the gallows, female pirates were reduced from legends to lessons, examples sacrificed to uphold empire and order. To be turned into a lesson is to be stripped of interiority. Legends that once spoke to the possibility of escape were now retold as cautionary tales, their myths flattened into morality plays for an anxious, consolidating state. Women who had claimed danger and risk were transformed into objects that reaffirmed the domestic and the docile. Before the rope, many female pirates felt the whip. Flogging, an ancient and excruciating punishment, was frequently used by naval authorities and colonial governors to inflict public humiliation and physical agony on captured pirates. For women, this punishment carried an added layer of spectacle. Their bodies became instruments of warning, and the crowds were expected to learn through their suffering. Flogging was not simply corporal punishment. It was communicative violence. Every lash sent a syllable into the public lexicon: obey. The tools of flogging were as precise as the tools of execution. The cat-o'-nine-tails was designed to tear, to remind the audience that flesh could be rewritten into shame. The sight and sound of flogging, bruises rising like dark maps on the back, the wet sound when skin broke, served as a visceral supplement to the legal discourse. Hunger, humiliation, and pain became rhetorical devices used to instruct both the punished and the observers. Flogging was typically administered with the cat-o'-nine-tails, a brutal whip of knotted cords capable of tearing flesh with each strike. Sentences could range from 12 lashes to over 100, depending on the severity of the offense and the decision of the court. The punishment was carried out publicly, often on the docks or outside the prison gates, where townspeople, including women and children, would gather to witness the spectacle. Public punishment was pedagogical by design. Men who might consider a life of plunder were to watch and think twice. Women who dared step into male domains were to be reminded of their fate. The presence of families in the audience was no accident. The spectacle taught children the parameters of a social life and reinforced a gendered division of labor that served the economy and the state. In that sense, flogging was not merely punitive, it was formative. In 1720, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, after their capture by Jamaican authorities, were reportedly kept in deplorable conditions and subjected to harsh treatment even before their trial. Though there's no direct record of flogging being used on them during imprisonment, female pirates in other colonies, such as those captured off the coast of the American colonies or the West Indies, were routinely flogged as part of their sentencing or to force confessions. The conditions of confinement preceding trial often functioned as interrogative theatres designed to break individuals before they were seen by the law. Sleep deprivation, hunger, and humiliation were all methods of extorting confessions. For women like Bonny and Read, the story that survives shows a mixture of myth and fact. Their notoriety guaranteed that their names would travel, but not necessarily that their truth would be spared the filter of moralizing male chroniclers. Records kept by authorities emphasize spectacle and control. Personal letters and marginalia sometimes capture quieter, more human details that hint at strength that outlived the immediate threat. For naval authorities, the flogging of female pirates served two purposes: deterrence and degradation. Women who had dared to lead or fight aboard ships were brought low before the public eye, their blood mingling with salt air and cobblestones. When authority mixes with theatre, it seeks not just compliance, but awe. That awe was cold-blooded and intended to be remembered. The salt that mixed with blood left crystalline stains on the cobbles and documented an economy of fear, an economy where power was extracted not only through taxes and trade, but through the spectacle of suffering. These punishments were not just about justice, they were about control, and the spectacle of pain ensured the message reached far beyond the gallows. Punishment was a form of public politics, the theatre in which social order was rehearsed and reforged. It replaced conversation with examples, argument with demonstration. The spectacle simplified complexity. It told a story in a way that law could not, because the law required literacy and deliberation. Spectacle required only sight. Not every captured female pirate was marched to the gallows. In some cases, particularly in colonial ports of the Caribbean, West Africa, and the Americas, women were not executed, but instead forced into lives of concubinage, coerced labor, or slavery. However, direct evidence of this fate specifically for female pirates is sparse. Historians acknowledge that while piracy was a male-dominated domain, women involved in piracy could meet a wide range of ends, depending on their nationality, race, class, and the discretion of colonial authorities. This is one of the cruel ironies of historical research. The most intimate suffering is often the least recorded. The archival silence around concubinage and coercion reveals what the empire wanted to hide. Where evidence exists, it often steps out of legalistic categories and into the messy realm of market exchange and violent intimacy, where a woman's body might be sold or transferred like cargo. That absence in the record is itself a kind of testimony. Not everything worthy of memory made it to the docket. In the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, where the lines between piracy, privateering, and slavery often blurred, captured women aboard pirate ships, especially those of African or indigenous descent, were sometimes sold into bondage, regardless of their status as crew members or captives. Archival records from Portobello and Cartagena during the late 17th century describe women taken from pirate ships and processed as spoils of war. The term spoils of war is a bureaucratic euphemism that cloaks a brutal transfer of personhood into property. The marketplace demanded labor and bodies. Warfare and piracy supplied them. The spaces between private justice and market interest were porous. A woman's fate could hinge on which set of players controlled her at the moment of capture: a naval officer, a colonial merchant, a plantation owner. Each carried different incentives, and none were particularly concerned with the dignity of those they transacted. And it's here, in these silences of history, between the floggings, the gibbets, the courts, and the markets, that the story of female pirates refuses to die. Because even when the empire tried to turn them into lessons, warnings, or commodities, they became something far more enduring. Proof that rebellion has never belonged to men alone. Proof that even in the darkest theaters of punishment, some women still carved their names into the sea. And proof that no amount of rope, law, or empire could fully erase those who dared to live outside the script written for them.